RAD Radio presents the RAD pROBcast.
My guest on the pROBcast is Eddie Ford, co-owner with his wife Tammy of NorCal Gun Vault in Rockland, California. Hi, Eddie.
Hey, how you doing, sir?
Good. Thanks for being here. Always a very popular guest on the regular RAD show, where usually you're inundated with questions about
Why can't I buy handguns?
Why can't I buy handguns? How come you don't have ammo? And so if my dad bought me a gun and then he gave it to me, I bought a gun in Washington. Can I bring it to Cal? These are all legitimate questions.
Yeah,
I'm not mocking
right.
the questions, but it's almost like you've been on a few times. You pretty much know when you walk in every question you're going to get. Because guns, this is one of the reasons we love working with you guys at NorCal Gun Vault. Guns are so intimidating to so many people.
Right.
And you guys try to make it as unintimidating as possible. So let's start with guns. I know this doesn't change anything universally yet, but recently there was a court decision that doesn't change everything, but a federal appeals court, and they're kind of an outlier here, they ruled that banning handgun sales to Americans under 21 violates the Second Amendment. This is one of these things I've never really understood. I don't understand how you can be 18 and you can vote and you can sign up to defend our country like you did, and you can go overseas and put your life on the line and maybe lose it, but you're not responsible enough to own a handgun.
Right.
But this is a law that, if I remember correctly, Lyndon Johnson signed into enact in 1968, and it's been upheld over and over and over again.
It's just never been really challenged. I don't know. I was trying to look and see if there were any precedent cases, but again, it depends on the way that the court decision is written and how far it'll hold up, and whether they just poo-poo it or not in the appellate courts or the the federal courts as it moves up the chain.
So this particular one I'm talking about was middle of July, Fourth Circuit in Richmond, Virginia, wrote that the law is an arbitrary restriction that relegated 18 to 20-year-olds to a second-class status. How is that not true?
Right. It is. I mean, it's not. It isn't true. I mean, they have said you can't buy them. I mean, even in California now, if you're under 21, you can't buy a semi-automatic rifle.
Right.
And
But how can you be mature enough to vote?
They want you to vote at 16.
Right. So exactly. Right. There's a movement to lower the voting age to 16. So you're mature enough to decide the leaders of the city, county, country, but you're not mature enough at 18 to own a handgun, although you can own a shotgun.
Right.
I don't understand the thinking here.
Right.
So we just agree on that.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, you're exactly right on it in the sense that it's ridiculous. I mean, you carry a sidearm in your job in the military, or you carry a sidearm in your job at law enforcement, but you can't go out and buy. Now, whether there's a loophole for the law enforcement under 18 to 21, I'd have to dig into that. I don't really deal with it much because most cops don't buy a lot of guns.
So
they get them issued. Now,
I know that, and my read on this is there's two groups. There's the middle of the road group that may not even own guns, but they're certainly not anti-gun. And then there's the anti-gun group. And I know that the pushback initially on that point would be, well, yeah, but in the military and in law enforcement, you're trained. You don't have to be trained in America. Some states you have to take a little test on the computer and that kind of, but I don't believe there's any state where you're required to take a certain amount of training before you can buy a gun. And if it is, it's an outlier. And that would be their pushback that. And so your answer to that is what?
My answer to that is training is training is training. Whether you're, and I mean, if they want to, like for the hunter safety class, to get a hunting license, you have to do a pretty extensive test and class and all this. Why not do the same thing for handguns at 18? Because it's going to be way more training than just guessing questions, 30 questions on an FSC exam, and you got 25% chance of getting them right. So, again, education, and you and I have talked about this, I can't think at length, all this is education is key. And our society, as we've grown more urban and less rural, less, agrarian, we've kind of gotten away from kids handling guns at a young age in mostly the coast. I think the Midwest is probably a little bit more gun handling kids. And I mean, I handled them as a kid, but I was by no means an expert, but I knew safety. I knew right from wrong. I knew not to play with them. So why can't we do the same thing here? And I don't think it's ever just been pushed that far, is the law gets made and nobody's had the wherewithal to push it. I think with the shift or perceived shift in the Supreme Court, which we assume is going to shift, but you never know, there's more that you're going to see coming up through the ranks because they really want these things answered at the high court so that they either have to completely rewrite and rethink the laws or they get dismissed altogether.
So is that your compromise proposal, or are you a genuine believer in the idea that we should require some type of safety course to become a first-time handgun owner?
I don't see anything wrong with it because it's education. It may cost you, and again, I mean, we have a right to these guns. I get it.
Right, because that's the absolutist version.
Right,
look, anybody can buy it. What are you doing telling me I have to take a class?
Sure. This, again, coming from my point of view, I don't see a problem with training. You know, even if it's a $50 class, even if it's free, paid for by the state, I don't care. Education is education, and having to go through some kind of handling operation, it just makes more sense. Then when they become shoppers, they have a better idea what they're looking at. That's like our basic handgun course that we go over all of these same things. Why not have a 2-hour course on this, you know, and then you take the test and you're done. It's a nothing burger really, because you're just educating. You're not asking them to commit all this extra effort into it. And I'll probably be willing to bet that most folks who are first-time buyers would love that kind of information walking into it.
Well, and that, especially now, as you know more than anyone, this explosion in first-time gun owners. Mm-hmm. And every time you're on the show, we get endless people who say, I've never even held a gun. How do I know what gun to buy? And then you always recommend, I mean, you say, look, you can come into the shop and we'll show you various things, but you always recommend your classes for that exact reason.
Right.
To figure out, you know, size and what what gun's going to work for you and things like that.
Sure.
But in the end, like if you were pushed, you're an absolutist on the Second Amendment.
Yes,
you
absolutely.
wouldn't suggest that we should make that class mandatory to buy a handgun. You think it's a good idea?
Yeah, I will say that.
Okay.
I mean, but think about the driver's test. I mean, do you want to just hand a license to somebody who's never been trained to drive a car? You know, you look
the argument there though is driving's a privilege.
Driving's a privilege, and you're right. And again, it's I would say that I would recommend it. Whether it's mandatory or not, I don't really have any druthers.
This is the problem, and you and I have talked about this on and off the air. This is, of course, the problem with society is everything is polarized. It's one or the other, and there's not a lot of room for reasonable middle ground solutions. Because I get the impression from having known you for a few years now, you and I are what I call reasonable gun owners. Mm-hmm. We're not resistant to things like universal background checks or background checks as much as we can. Who wants to put guns in the hand of felons?
Right.
And you and I aren't resistant to the idea of saying, hey guys, please let's train people on. Hey, I bet you and I could come to an agreement that there's nothing wrong with offering handgun safety as an elective in high school.
Right.
You don't have to take it, but anybody who's thinking of maybe owning a gun, enroll your kid.
Used to be Boy Scouts.
Used to be Boy Scouts. Well, we know what happened to them.
Yep.
Have guys like you and your brother go out and teach these classes.
Yeah.
That's all reasonable, but to other Second Amendmentists, nope, you're chipping away.
Right.
At the right, and they're not necessarily wrong about that because people take it.
Right.
People, you give them an inch, they take a mile,
mm-hmm.
and I think you're really sensitive to that the last few years. You feel like you're seeing that more, don't right?
Yeah. I mean, they're just California is a prime example of that. Let's just throw a law out there and then let them fight it in court. But while they're fighting it, the law's there. We're setting the example. We're the stalwart in Second Amendment, you know, making sure that gun safety and fighting crime and violence, but yet they're letting out, you know, I mean, you look at the policies they're making. Well, they'll restrict guns over here. They'll let criminals out over here for, you know, lesser offenses or whatever the case is. It doesn't jive, and it's a feel good kind of lawmaking, or maybe it's, and Tammy and I have talked about this, maybe it's a consequence of the term limits that some of these folks want to make a difference, and they only have X years to make a difference. So, you know, my cousin was shot and it was unnecessary. So let's do something in and have Donovan's Law or something, but without really fleshing it out. Is this going to stand? Was it Proposition 8? Remember when they made a constitutional amendment against non-heterosexual marriage?
Yeah, it's Prop 8 in 2008. Yeah.
You know, and even at that time, regardless of whatever your religious beliefs or whatever, the Constitution is not designed to prevent you from something. It's designed to protect you.
Right.
And so even when that law was written, right, wrong, or indifferent on your views on it, the law was wrong because you're writing a law to prevent it. And they're doing that same thing. They're writing laws that prevent you from executing constitutional rights. And that kind of stuff's overturned all the time, but the Supreme Court for years just would not touch Second Amendment. Heller was the last real big decision that everybody kind of remembers. I think there was a minor one, and I may be saying minor, but there may have been one in between. And don't quote me.
Is Heller the D.C. one?
Heller's the D.C. one.
Which basically said that was a time when, correct me if I'm wrong, D.C. for decades was the murder capital of the world.
Yeah, and they had zero.
And no handguns.
Right, no guns in the city limits at all, etc. But
the Supreme Court said you can't do that.
You can't do that. And everything that's since then has quoted Heller, because everything kind of plays back to that, that essence of you can't just deny it. You really need to look at what you're doing. So now if you have a crime control bill, which I think the president right now is touting that the last gun law that he touched was the 94 crime control bill, and that's where they did the assault weapon ban.
Which did nothing.
Right. It did nothing for...
I mean, we have the stats.
Right. Nothing for crime statistics or anything, but, it made a base happy, made a political base happy. And it's just the politics. I mean... So
back to one of your points about California and other states, in fact, D.C. is another great example. They put these laws into place, and as you said, they worked their way through their courts, but that can take decades. It was like, wasn't it 30 years in D.C.?
Right.
And did you say they're counting on it?
Yeah, I think so.
Because it changes the culture, right, or it makes you think a certain way about things. We're at all-time record highs of known gun ownership, in America, and purchases. A lot of people buy guns as like their last bastion of defense for security, deterrence, things like that, and yet we are at an explosion in crime right now in America. Right. Particularly in big cities, but we're seeing it seep in to places like Roseville, a suburb of Sacramento that is usually the haven for whatever Beaver, Cleaver, Peoria, Illinois type city you're picturing. That's Sacramento's is Roseville, California. If all of these citizens own guns, how come more of them aren't using them brazenly to stop all this crime? In other words, are we not as insane as we're told we are? Because what we're told is, oh my God, all these guns on the streets, all these guns in homes are going to lead to all of these shootings. And yet, people aren't whipping out their guns at Neiman Marcus when a bunch of clowns go in and take thousands of dollars in purses. Right. Where's the disconnect there?
I think part of that's probably either training or it's just... When you do your CCW training, they do talk about, when is the right time to pull it? And you really has to come down to, is your life threatened or is there a life threatened? And you have to be rock solid on that decision, because as soon as you pull it, you've opened up a whole legal can of worms. I mean, it really makes you think. And I mean, it's something that they stress in the classes is it doesn't mean don't pull it. It means use your best judgment. But once you pull it, understand that the legal gamut is opened and you will be a target by the defense lawyers potentially because you pulled the firearm. So you have to make sure that you have all those ducks in a row and you have a very, airtight case that you felt like your life was in danger or, something around you was happening that warranted it. But we just don't see enough of it. And we just had that one. I just saw an article about a couple that was followed home from the Galleria and
in Roseville,
right, and they were robbed in their driveway. Didn't say it was an armed robbery. Didn't say anything else about it. But if they're getting that brazen, then we just have to be aware. And then you have to, they have to ask yourself, what was the level of threat, or did they just run up, grab the stuff out of the back of their car and take off? But how did they report it? The local media has a tendency to not report when somebody does something right with a firearm. They're more likely to report either nothing on it or that find some other slant on it, because they all drink the Kool-Aid.
I don't think either one of us is suggesting in that example, which was in the middle of the afternoon, I think on a Thursday, where this couple was followed home from the Galleria. Obviously, the people saw what they were buying or whatever, or how much they were buying, and then, as you said, robbed them in their driveway. I don't think either one of us is suggesting that the answer to that scenario is that the dude or the woman in her purse pulls out a gun and starts shooting at them because they're robbing them. Right. Now, maybe in a very extreme circumstance, although you bring up the legalities of it, now we're on their property. If you're a legal gun owner, maybe you're producing the weapon is what you hope is a deterrent. Although I don't think either one of us would say that's the first go-to move. There's other non-lethal. First of all, back it up, not to victim shame, but be aware of your surroundings. Watch when the same car is making the same turns as you, things like that. Then there's non-lethal stuff. Tasers, which are legal in California and most places. I have many tasers, and for this exact reason, have them almost always,
Right.
because it's a great first place to start. So I just want to make sure we were clear. It's not like we're suggesting pull out a gun.
Right. No.
But you bring up the CCW training, all of the legal ramifications,
Right.
because you're absolutely right that a lawyer or prosecutor can go to town on you. There's also, and this, I don't think this gets talked about enough. We try to talk about it on the RAD show when people get that, and it's not just radio courage, because it's social media courage or whatever, where they're in the scenario of somebody, they don't have to be breaking into their home. And they'll say stupid stuff like, you come on my property, I'll just shoot you. Right. It's like, first of all, when I hear somebody say that, I know that I'm dealing with somebody that's never really been in a real world situation.
Right.
We're going to talk more about your bio and stuff later, but your brother was a cop. Your dad was a cop. You did 20 years in the Navy. And then if I understand correctly, did you do... what do they call it? Did you do contract work as well?
Yeah, but it wasn't like contractor. You think like operator contractor. I was a electronics guy. So,
but you were in Iraq.
Yes, sir.
During that.
Yep.
So cops. You were in the military. You know lots of military people. Everybody, every cop that I know, every military person that I know, has either experienced this or knows someone who has, and they will all say the same thing. It doesn't matter how often it happens. We hope the number is 0, but it changes you when you take a life.
Yes.
And this is the thing that I try to point out that we talk about. It's like, you're right. You have to be, when you pull your gun, you have to be ready for all those legal ramifications.
Yeah.
You also have to be ready for what it's going to feel like when you're responsible for the death of another human. Yep. And I know that's a really hard thing for people to imagine that haven't experienced it, but I know you've talked to people that have. Yeah. And it changes them.
It does. And you either, and they'll either harden, or and I won't say soften, but it'll have the other impact of, instead of hardening their resolve, it may make them question, or it may make them, it has an effect on you. You've just taken life. That person, whatever the situation is, and how much of your life their life about or don't know about, it doesn't extend beyond that point. And you have done that. And one of the taking a life has always been one of those delineators, and I use it when I talk a little bit about handgun safety, is don't put your finger on that trigger until you're ready to take a life. If you're at the range, you're practicing to take a life. You have to always keep that in mind, because people will just unconsciously go, and you can't do that. The chance of a misfire or a negligent, it's way too great. So taking a life is always that delineator that has to be understood when you own a firearm. When you carry a firearm, I mean, I fathom completely the awesome and terrible responsibility I have for carrying a firearm loaded in the Placer County jurisdiction that the sheriff has granted me permission to do. That's a lot of trust in that it's being done. That trust is not lost on me. I understand the enormity, the gravity of it. Every time I put my firearm on, I understand the gravity of what I'm doing. And so if people that are buying firearms can kind of get some of that, then that builds in that barrier of decision. Do I proceed, or what am I trying to do here? Am I trying to intimidate? Am I going to have to defend myself? But if you're going to pull it, you have to be ready to make that decision and not let it turn around on you, because the consequences could be devastating.
I think one of the things that drives that home that I've noticed over the last few months, obviously we're getting more and more and more dash cam and body cam videos. And every single time a cop shoots someone, the cop almost immediately, depending on the situation, if by shooting someone it has diffused all of the threat, the cop almost immediately breaks down. I mean, they'll instinctively run over to the person and begin life-saving techniques, which to a lot of people is like unfathomable. It's like, how could you have the ability to shoot and then save? But that's what cops are trained to do. But you see them, and there's one that I can't remember if it was Chicago, where it seems like everything happens all the time, where a cop shot like a teenager and felt he had no other choice. And the minute he did, he started screaming like, "Oh my God, get help over here." I mean, and we don't even know at that moment, right? He didn't even know the outcome. He didn't know if he or she's going to live.
Right.
But just the idea that he pulled the trigger takes so much out of him.
Right.
And they're trained.
Right. To react to this.
To react to it.
Understand.
And also they're trained to be ready to take a life to save lives.
Right.
And yet it's still gets that reaction out of them.
Yeah.
Which is why most police departments have mandatory after shooting counseling and all this other stuff. And I don't know how we drive that home to more people, like what you said, other than talking about it, more training and stuff.
Right.
Because I think a lot of these tough guys would feel a lot differently. I hope, unless they're sociopaths.
No, but I think some of it's just bravado, and again, we talk about firearms bringing peace of mind, and I think that's what you're seeing right now is this lack of security, this lack of feeling like that the system can take care of me. And so they're coming out to try and gain some manner of peace of mind that they can protect themselves and their family. They just have to understand that what protecting themselves and their family with a firearm is going to do. And I get many people that have first time come in and bought, and then they've come back and said, well, if, what else can I have? And it's not a gun. Can I use mace? Can I use this? And we've tried to make sure that they understand the gamut. There's times where I don't carry a firearm, but I carry mace.
Yeah. I own more tasers than guns for that exact reason.
Right. Because it's
the last thing.
Right. All you're trying to do is to stop the threat. And I don't mean stop it as in stop their breathing.
Right.
I mean mitigate the threat so that they stop being a threat. And we talk about that a lot in the training is that, when you bring that firearm out, and if you have confidence and you look like you're razor on it, and if this person flinches in any way threatening, their life could be over. And I don't mean bravado, I just mean confidence. That's a deterrent. And that's what you want to think about when you pop it out there is you want them to understand, and you want your message conveyed that I am prepared to protect myself at all costs. And the cost could be devastating for you. That's a deterrent, and that's your first, and that's what your hope is going to stop it. There are 999% of the chances, or 99.9% of the time, I'm not going to pull.
Right.
I'm going to mitigate the threat by whatever means possible. It's only at that last minute will I pull. But having never been in that situation to where I've had to, I can't say for certain that's going to be the way it is. Now, they've talked about arming teachers in schools, right? But what they don't know is what happens when you start getting shot at. How do you react? Do you become more of a victim or threat than you do a deterrent?
Right. Not everybody responds to gunfire by returning gunfire.
Right. Or hating, whatever. They may just panic, freeze, and stop. And that's what they don't know. And so, and how do you prepare for that? Get shot at? And I know from my past, experiences, I've had shooting in my direction. I'll say that. I don't believe for once I was the target, but it was in my direction. And I didn't freak out, freeze, drop to the ground, whatever. I sought cover, found the, closest cover situation and moved into it and then assessed. But I don't know if somebody's pointing a gun at me or my wife, how I'm going to react,
Right. Or even that experience, which most of us have never experienced, even with that experience, you don't know for sure, like God forbid somebody tried to rob your store, exactly how you would react in your store. It's not the same as you're out in the field or, in theater and or in your house even, right? We all believe, we hope, and some of us even plan for it, but in the moment, until you're there,
right,
it's a totally different animal.
Right, which is why you prepare.
Exactly. By the way, just a random question because we're talking about taking a life and everything. In all of your military experience or everybody, have you ever known a sniper? I have always been curious, and I've never gotten to know one. I have always been curious to know how they mentally process what they do.
I know a couple that have been through sniper school, and I know people intimately that have. I know one person, and I won't go into it, who's been to sniper school, and it just comes down to mission focus. What is your job? Most snipers are there to protect. So if you're protecting, it changes the equation rather than deep cover assassination. And I don't know of anybody I've ever been able to talk to that has had a sniper school has been that guy to go in deep recon. And, you'd be talking to CIA folks, you'd never even see them typically for that, I would think, or other governmental agencies, but mostly military. When you look at like Chris Kyle, they were always Overwatch, they're always making sure that, or they're trying to take out another sniper where they're going predator. But again, it's a vein of protection.
And same mindset too, right? Like if you're on SEAL Team 6 looking for Osama bin Laden, It's not the same thing as what we're talking about of taking another citizen's life who's threatening you. There's a different mindset.
You're trained beyond that. Yeah, that's just mission focus, and you have an objective, and if there's threats, you eliminate them and you move on to the objective. And those guys are, and I know a couple of those guys. And again, it's just you have to train that hesitancy out, because if you don't, you won't know, and they won't make it past the first mission.
So you mentioned earlier, you alluded to the fact the Supreme Court right now is 6 conservative, 3 liberal justices. I don't think all 6 of the conservative justices are as conservatives would like them to be, particularly Chief Justice John Roberts.
Right.
But that's a pretty overwhelming in modern day times balance, which is why, as you said, gun advocates are actually now pushing to get into the courts.
Yes.
Like, this is their time.
Right.
Do you see, and as you said, they've been resistant for a while, but they've taken up a few, or they've shown an indication. Do you see this over the next couple of years? I know what you hope. Do you see maybe some groundbreaking Supreme Court gun decisions?
I see them taking up the cases. How they sway, I don't know. I hope it makes it through the appellate courts where they're at, but I think it's the time that they're being pushed. I don't think they can avoid it any longer, and I think there's enough of a need for them to examine these laws, because it is straight constitutionality. If this was a civil rights law, a civil rights issue, it would be in the courts. It would be up there much faster. But they don't see it that way, because again, it's whether you feel firearms are necessary or not.
Would you describe where we are socially and culturally? Is there a war on guns?
Yeah, there's been one for a while, though. I mean, it's, a war on guns, and anybody who thinks that they need one. I mean, because you get a lot of the questions, why do you have to have an AR-15? I mean, I have family members by marriage that are not pro AR-15, and they don't understand why we need to buy these kind of guns or have these kind of guns.
And what's your answer? Why do you need an AR-15? Why do you need a gun that shoots 30 rounds?
It's available. I mean, it's available and it's legal. I mean, why not? Why do you have to have a vet? Why can't everybody just drive Volkswagens? I mean, so it just comes down to what's available. And ARs are not like, the expensive elitist days. This is just common stuff. You can build an AR reasonably for about $450 in normal times.
And another one that you get a lot is, who needs that many guns?
Right.
Everybody has a different number, whether it's 3, 5, 20. Well, why do you need that many guns? I mean, I have answers. My example in modern times is I try to give it like a legitimate answer. I mean, you're absolutely right. The answer that should shut everybody up is because I can. Mm-hmm. It's my right and I can. But, then a lot of people scream, they say, that's not what the Second Amendment means, and you get into the weeds. So I try to give a real world example of, home invasions are really big right now.
Yeah, they're a real thing.
And so when I've got 5 guys breaking into the house at once, and my wife, who thank God she's trained from serving in the military, and I need to scatter, we need to be able to scatter to separate places and have guns in different parts of the house, which also goes back to your AR example or high capacity magazines. Why do I need 15 bullets? Well, because if I got to take out 5 guys, the likeliness that with 9 bullets I'm going to do it is very low.
Right, and that's a big part of Justice Benitez's ruling on the high cap or California's 10-round magazine limit,
which he ruled it's unconstitutional, but it's on pause until it goes higher, right?
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
where we're at.
They're waiting for in fact, I think the Ninth Circuit, I think they recently heard it en banc. The way I understand it and the way I read on that path that it's on is that a lot of these decisions in the appellates are being held up until this current Supreme Court case that's before them. It's the New York case, and they're seeing which way that's going to swing before they make their decision.
And in the New York case, they're deciding what?
Can you have a gun outside your house? Right. And that even means transporting it to the range, because the law has kind of locked it down to my understanding on that. So, and I really try and make sure, I've always tried to understand a problem from every angle, not just from my lens. I want to understand it from all the angles, because to me, you make better decisions that way. And being in the business I'm in, I hear a lot of 2A stuff, a lot of pro 2A stuff, and there's misinformation on all sides. There is. I heard I was talking to a gentleman yesterday who is a retired sheriff deputy from Jefferson Parish in Louisiana, and he was there during Katrina. and operating patrols and all that stuff. And I heard some interesting stories that kind of counter some misinformation that I've heard from the other from the 2A side about confiscations. There was something going around on social media about, and during Katrina, the law enforcement went in and confiscated guns from people. I was talking to him. I asked him directly. I said, "Did you confiscate any guns?" He goes, "The only guns that were taken out of houses were abandoned houses. They were sending cops to abandoned houses so that those guns didn't wind up on the street in the wrong hands. They were, because the people that had them could go back and collect them."
So the videos that go around show like teams of 6 heavily armed cops going into homes, but the context is never given that it's a vacant home, which, as I understand it, they knew through registration laws that there was a gun or might be a gun in there.
Right.
And that's exactly right. They were concerned with all the looting.
Right.
That the criminals were going to get in there, and now they're armed.
Right. And it was just my understanding of the description that was given. And again, I'm going by second party efforts here, or information, is that it was done in the sense, it wasn't done to take them away from people. It was done in the sense that they weren't abandoned and they weren't left to become, black guns on the street in the sense that nobody knows about them, the ghost situation where all of a sudden they just all disappear.
And the problem is that story's not sexy enough for the far 2A crowd.
No, and again, it's not. It doesn't push the message. And again, everything now is about pushing message. And again, looking at it from all angles. And so that was one of the interesting angles that I've seen. Again, there's probably more angles to it. There's a political angle. I don't know, because I don't know any Louisiana politicians. I don't know any of the decision makers. I just know this one guy and his lens. But it did kind of paint it a little bit different for me so that I have a greater understanding of that situation. And it makes sense because I don't want the bad guys. If I have to abandon my house for any reason, I would rather law enforcement come take them, safeguard them, so that when I'm able to return, I can take whatever measures to get them back, rather than have them fly out and wind up being used to harm other people unnecessarily.
Well, and this is the thing that frustrates me as a gun owner and a Second Amendment supporter, is that stereotypically most of us that hold that view are also pro-law enforcement.
Right.
And yet I see more and more often when forced to choose, we're abandoning law enforcement. Because the way I hear that story, again, secondhand, now third hand, whatever, but the way I hear it is I don't want criminals armed because the first people they're going to use them against are cops when they're threatened.
Right, or us.
Right, us. But here's my dream scenario is that when they try to threaten us, there's a cop around. Well, now the cop's in danger,
right.
and that I don't want that.
Right.
But for some reason, because we have to be so rigid, we go, oh well, screw the cops in that case.
Right.
You should have left the gun in that house,
right.
That abandoned house,
right.
And then that can get really frustrating. Looking at it from all angles and trying to be reasonable Second Amendment proponents, what about the issue of glamorizing or glorifying guns with kids? Now, you and I grew up in a time where we're shooting, at the very least, Nerf dart guns at each other, and
cap guns,
guns,
right.
Guns that look and sound like guns. And I don't think that's exactly why you wound up in the military, or that's why you own a gun shop. I don't think it's why I own guns. And it doesn't seem like either one of us is excessively violent, but right. That's what we're told we're doing. We're glamorizing guns with kids. Where is the line with that? I mean, I know that you are absolutely a proponent of, especially with hunting, hey, if you want to get your kid a gun and teach them safety and all that, but what about people that are not necessarily of that vein? They're like, I don't want my child to think that guns are a toy.
Right.
I mean, there's some reasonableness to that. I would still fall back on parental responsibility.
Right.
But where are you on that, just in general?
And again, I can only cite from my own experience. My father being a cop, there were always guns in the house. We didn't have a safe. And my father's idea that if a gun was unloaded, it was a club, it was useless. So every gun was loaded. But we understood the gravity of what we were looking at. And there was always we always knew that if we wanted to go to the range and shoot, look at something, have any questions about it, if we told my father, he would willingly, as soon as he had time, like I said, but he would go get it and we would discuss whatever we wanted to discuss. So there was that kind of, he understood that reducing the curiosity reduces the danger and the risk, doesn't eliminate, but it reduces the risk of a child doing something foolish. The more we guard it and protect it and make it a no-no. I mean, how many kids drink? You can't drink under that. It kind of comes into that same frame of mind. And so many kids video games are part of our society. And whether it's John Wick movies or, and again, I'm not just targeting
I love
movies.
the John Wick movies,
Yeah,
by the way.
I watch one of that. I'm just saying that it's become so part of our exciting adventure culture, whether it's a Western game where you're in the Wild West, or your Call of Duty, or your other games, you are using a firearm to perform actions within that game of whatever function. You can desensitize people to that in a sense. You know, my take on some of the Sandy Hook stuff was that child was desensitized to it. It became part of the fantasy in a sense, because I mean, he didn't have any reason to have anything against any of those children at that school, but what he did was heinous. Did that play a part in it? But I mean, but I don't want to get in part of the, rock and roll and Ozzy Osbourne is the devil's music. It does. It's not the case, but you have to get your child to understand the framework of which you're playing. My son played he played Grand Theft Auto, for example.
Well, that's a hell of a game.
Right. And I had to teach him that while in the course of the game, that behavior was there. That is not acceptable behavior in society.
You don't kick a hooker when she's down in the head.
Right.
Yeah.
You're living a fantasy. I mean, he used to crack up at me because I wouldn't do that stuff playing the game.
Oh.
And he's like, Dad, why don't you? No, I can't, because I just can't do it.
Right.
It's not in the makeup, but yet to him, it's just part of the game, and that's fine. But it didn't translate to his real life. He's not out beating up, people and stealing cars. So it comes within the framework of parenting, I think, to make it understood those boundaries. Setting those boundaries, understanding those boundaries, but then also setting the example as well. I
remember years ago, I don't remember where I was, but it was a fairly major city. I was on vacation, and there was a sports bar they had their TVs on, and you could see them from the streets. And whatever event was going on, there were a few of us that were watching from outside the sports bar. And this couple is walking by with what I would guess is their 5 to 6 year old child. And as they walk by, the TV is showing commercials. And whatever came on, it featured a picture of a gun. Maybe it was a public service announcement. Maybe there was a gun show in town. I don't know. But I put this all together after the fact. They turned the kid around and shielded the kid's eyes because they didn't even want him to see a gun. And I could hear some of the chatter as they walked away, and I thought, oh my God, this is their solution to gun safety in their minds, is don't even show him that they exist. Right. Which seems to be the driving force behind this no toy guns anywhere, don't let kids play with guns thing, which I don't understand how we got to that point as opposed to the example that you're giving, whether it's Grand Theft Auto or Nerf guns, right? And teaching the difference. Right. This whole remove it from society thing, to me, makes them more dangerous. Right. Because they have no understanding of what a gun is. Well, I mean, and it comes into so many parts of our society now. We don't have discussions with our kids about racism. We don't have discussions with our kids about sexual preference, whatever. We don't give them the framework to understand and make those decisions because, well, I don't want to expose it. And believe me, kids are exposed to, in my opinion, strictly my opinion, kids are exposed to way too much at an early age now. But you can't avoid it because media is everywhere and it permeates. So us as parents need to have discussions about those things, and make sure that they understand the framework within all of this. I have my dad grew up in California, and this is off the gun thing, but we're talking about like racism and teaching kids and the innocence of kids. This is a great story. They went back to Texas when I think he said he was about 4.5, 5 years old. They pull into a gas station in Texas, and there's 2 water fountains. One says white, one says colored. My dad takes off toward the colored water fountain. He said, my mom about yanked my arm out of my socket. She says, where are you going? He said, I want to see what color the water is. But isn't that a beautiful story of innocence? Because you're taught that stuff, but you're also taught that it's going to be there and how to frame it. And that's whether it's guns or whatever. Us as parents need to take that responsibility of doing that, because by shielding them and not doing it, we're doing our kids a disservice. Did you hear about this Lego gun? So this is a story I found like a week ago. It's a company in Utah, and they make custom modifications to firearms, and they have a kit that encases a Glock handgun in red, yellow, and blue Lego blocks. And they call it the Block 19, and they sell it for $550 to $750 depending on the specifics. And their pitch is that shooting is fun. And actually, they said on their I think it was their Twitter feed that I grabbed this from. Here's the thing: guns are fun, shooting is fun, 30 rounds full auto is fun. And the reaction to it, of course, overwhelming was, well, what's not fun is the reality that thousands of children unintentionally shoot themselves or get shot every year. In other words, you take a Glock and you make it look like a Lego toy.
Right.
And their point is, well, but it's for adults. But is that too much? Is that too far for you? Because I saw a picture. I wanted to print out a picture for you.
Yeah,
but it looks like Legos.
Right. And I mean, again, it's an interesting gimmick, whether or not it's mass marketable. I mean, and I don't mean whether it's going to sell or not. I just mean whether it's, you have to choose that right or wrong thing. You could say, hey, check out what I did. But in doing so, it's made for adults, obviously, because kids can't buy guns. But what does that adult do with it?
Right.
And if they do leave it lying out or something happens, the child may or may not understand the gravity of what they've holding, because you've kind of, it's like shielding dynamite in a toilet paper roll or something. I mean, you don't know what you're handling, so you lose that. And if it's meant as a gimmick, a gag or whatever, that's fine. As long as you keep it locked up, you make whatever you want to make. You can cover your gun and Legos all you want to with, hot glue. But is it the right thing to do? That's one of the tenements I live my life on. Is this the right thing to do or not the right thing to do?
Sure.
Whether right thing to do is a hard choice or an easy choice. Always an easy choice. It just may be a hard task to fulfill.
Again, we're back to the extremes, because I don't have children. Christina and I don't have kids. Well, how am I dangerous with the Lego gun?
Right.
Now, if you have kids, and to your point, if you own this gun that does look like a big Lego gun, and you've got kids that play with Legos, and you leave that gun lying out, well, that's goddamn stupid.
Right.
And you should be held accountable.
Right. And there's laws against that.
Right.
But you introduce
So the answer is don't
say,
make it, don't let them sell it.
It could be that, or just, if you have it, be smart.
Right.
That's all. Make the right decisions. That's, and again, it comes down to whether it's crime control, whether it's violence, gun control. We don't have a gun problem in this country. We have a violence problem in this country. People do not know how to cope with the extremes of emotions that are being generated, whether it's by the media, whether it's by the internet, whether it's by social, whatever form, we're being polarized. And whether it's intentional or not is completely up to you and what tinfoil hat you wear. But you have to be able to keep that within the framework of the extremes. But when people lose it, you don't know when or where somebody's boundary is. So you've got to understand, you've got to make right decisions, and it comes down to gun control. If you have the laws in place that say you're not to do this, you're not to do this, you're not to do this. I mean, you could say it's illegal to kill somebody with a car if you're driving drunk, but you don't take away the cars. And we always go back to that, but it's, again, because a car is not a right. But it goes back to that decision-making thing of how far do you go? Because the Pandora's box of guns in America is long since opened. You are never going to pull that. You could do a mass gun confiscation like Australia right now. And I was looking at one time the stats on Australia. When they pulled all the guns, other crimes went up. Suicides with guns went down. Suicides by other means went up, because you're not going to take the behavior out of people. You're just taking the manner in which they do it. And again, it comes down to feel-good law, because you have to change the culture and the society. You don't change the tools, because those tools are out there.
So when you were listing off all the things that have got us wrapped up, social media, the internet, maybe the media, as you said, whether you think it's intentional or not, then you add in a year and a half of COVID. Have you noticed? I know you've traveled recently. Mm-hmm. I think for the most part, you like me, you've been traveling as when you could, where you could. Mm-hmm. Have you noticed, as we've emerged a little bit more from the pandemic, behaviors in people that are different?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are much more aware of, I'm going to say their surroundings, but their immediate bacterial touch, the things that are going on. What are transmissible methods? Am I too close to that guy? Is that guy coughing? We're probably way more hyper aware of that now than we were before. On some scale, it's not a bad thing, but as long as we don't take it to the extremes. And you experienced when you traveled the whole airport masking from, airport to airport, on certain forms of transportation that are not airport, they want it. So you roll with it for now.
Have you noticed this is one of the things Christine and I really noticed in Vegas, and we've seen it more and more as people are starting to come out more, social awkwardness. That there's like this weird, I don't know how to interact with human beings thing.
Try a handshake.
Oh, God.
Do they kind of, like, it's kind of like the bro hug hand. You don't know what you're doing, right? The hand will go out. One will fist, one will go like this, and then all of a sudden you're fisting in their hand. And you're like, hey, let's just, elbow, whatever. But, it has made us more aware of that.
Yeah. Have you noticed that in customers that they're like a little weird? I mean, beyond just, oh my God, I'm in a gun store.
When you hand them a firearm, that's one thing. But if you go to shake a hand or any of that natural greeting stuff, any of that bonding stuff that's, mano a mano, per the touching, that has changed. And people are, again, it takes some time to change behavior. And we have had way more than that enough time to change behaviors. Is it going to snap back? Is it going to snap back partly? Probably not. Will we evolve and learn and become better? That's what I hope. But it really comes down to a personal choice of, do I want to shake that person's hand or not, and then go get sanitized real fast or whatever. I mean,
you mentioned your dad's from California.
Yes, sir.
And I didn't know until you sent me over a bio of yours, because we just never talked about it. You're from Stockton.
Yes, sir.
Was it Stockton then, like it is now?
No, it was Roseville then. I mean, there was South Stockton. I mean, there was bad. I mean, just like in any city, you have the parts that are, you kind of, if you don't belong there, you don't go there. I used to ride my bike from, if you know Stockton, Alpine Avenue over by I-5, all the way over to East Stockton, over like Highway 26. And I knew all the back roads. I used to ride to my grandfather's house or my grandfather's camper shop. And then either I'd ride back that night or I'd stay the night and come back. I wouldn't let my kid ride around the block on a bike in Stockton now, but because even my mom's neighborhood right now, which the last week, somebody came off and popped off a bunch of rounds in that cul-de-sac she lives in.
Oh.
And the cops that came out, the Stockton PD that came out and responded, said they were flabbergasted because this little area, this is probably one of the safest areas they've never had, but it's kind of been introduced into that. And it's just more of that permeating out of, but again, it's cultural. It's not geographical. It's the cultural behavior. What drew those guys in to do whatever we don't know, there's not enough evidence to know any of that, but were they targeting? Was it just random? But you're seeing, just how places evolve. And so I'll tell people now, so where'd you grow up? I grew up in Stockton. They look at me like I'm from South Central.
Right.
I'm like, no, it is what it is, but it's still a great city. There's not so much to do. They've closed down a lot of businesses. One of the reasons I didn't settle back there was there was no work for me when I came out of the Navy. Sacramento had more of an industrial environment for me to get into my field and work up here, but my family still all lives down in that area. I went to Tokay High School, went to Delta College. We used to call it University next to Gemco, UNG. And I did like a year of college for administrative justice because I was going to go into law enforcement. And through a confluence of events, I can tell you later, I didn't do it. I mean, my dad kind of said, I think you need some life experience. You need a little bit more maturity than you have to go and become a cop. You go into the military for 4 years, you come out, you will be a cop. I will make sure you follow that. You can do that path. And he was right, because going in changed some things in how I look at things. I saw the world. I see things differently. But, in doing so, Stockton was, just like Roseville, just like Sacramento. My dad always used to get upset because on the news, everything bad happened in Stockton. All the good stuff happened in Sacramento. It used to piss him off. But
so you followed that advice, but you didn't do 4 years.
No, they kept offering me money because I was in a high value field, I guess you call it, because I didn't sign up for 4 years. I actually had to sign up for 6. My first 2 years was straight school, but it wasn't like nuclear school, but it was electronic school. And back then, they taught you from the physics level of electronics through to what you did. And nowadays it's in the age of throwaway. A computer goes bad, you throw away the monitor. Back then you'd pull the 4 circuit boards, find out what's wrong, change out a resistor and go. But,
so that was your area of expertise in the Navy?
It was electronics. Yeah. So I worked in signals collection, signals intelligence.
And you did how long?
20 years.
And then you mentioned when you got out that you didn't resettle in Stockton for all those reasons you mentioned. And is it the fact that your from here and your family's here that keeps you in California? Because you're the kind of guy a lot of people look at and go, why do you live in California?
Right.
You know, gun laws and everything else. You could have gone anywhere in the country to start again.
Right.
Why stay?
Right. I mean, I wasn't part of the gun crowd, I guess you'd call it, back then. I mean, I always had them, always knew them. I knew the guns that I had. Realistically, I was in the Navy. I couldn't afford a lot of guns. I was always paying child support or something else. So coming back here, you know, I look at the path of my life, and I've talked to some other folks about this. I'm a firm believer that everything happens for a reason. Good, bad, and different. It makes you who you are. It's how you react and funnel yourself through that makes you into the person you are. And I look at everything I've got now, and I'm blessed. I'm blessed that everything that's happened, hardship, good times, bad times, whatever, it's all led me. And coming back to California brought me to Tammy, for example. And so had I stayed there, and I had opportunities to stay in Florida, I had opportunity to go to San Diego, but I didn't. So the path led me, back in here. Why do I stay in California? I mean, it's now is probably the most that I've ever thought about. Should I leave California? But I've got the store. And so until I can tie up that obligation or come to other means or whatever, then I'm here, and I'm here for the long haul. I've still got my mom's still around. Tammy's mom's still around. So we have family, grandkids. Some of our family members have moved out and away. So, it is spreading out a little bit, but, mostly it's family.
It is also, when you take out the politics, and you can't really say take out the homelessness and stuff, but the other thing, I mean, I'm basically from California, right, since I was 3 months old. It is a really cool state.
Yeah, everything's great but the politics.
Right.
I mean, if you take the politics out, then you don't have the tax issues, you don't have the homeless issues. I mean, we look at the homeless crisis right now. I mean, that started years ago when they eliminated state hospitals. Now, whether bad stuff was going on in there, they should have reformed that side of it. But to eliminate them, most of the folks that I've encountered, and being near the freeway, having my store, having the location it's at, there's some places where people can get out of the wind. There's some external outlets that they plug in their phones. Who knows where they get them? But they will congregate. And in any interaction I've had, I've been able to tell that there is some essence of mental illness in there. And that's not a blanket. That's just the ones that I've encountered. But with there's others that are just homeless. I mean, my son lived in his car for 2 months until he could figure things out. So there are instances where that can manifest itself without the mental issue.
My God, Eddie, you let your son live in a car?
Oh, yeah.
How did you not take him back in? Because that's going to be the reaction.
Because it was like the 9th time we'd not taken him back in. We finally,
it's time.
But he also said, Dad, I don't want to come back home. I need to do this on my own.
And he figured it out.
Right. And he did, just like everybody else will if they have the means. And I mean, a lot of the methods that they have in California, the housing, things like that, I can see there's some great intentions for helping people through that, but you got to ask yourself, do they want it?
So, by the way, when you were in the Navy, where'd you go? Where in the world? What type of places, continents, countries, whatever? Just a quick little list.
So I was what we call Atlantic sailor. I did a sea tour, which was on a ship out of Charleston, South Carolina. Deep South was amazing. I mean, I took Tammy on a tour down there, and I mean, there's a lot of history back there, good and bad, but it's still the people back there are just dynamite. I was able to go to the Mediterranean, North Atlantic. I've been above the Arctic Circle. I've been to the Baltic Sea, Norway, Finland, Denmark, places like that. So I got to, it's interesting the cultures up in there versus, say, the Mediterranean cultures. And then I've been to the Mediterranean a couple of times, seen every Caribbean island, whether I've had my feet on it or looking through binoculars. Been off the coast of Panama, been off the coast of South America. And then on the PAC side, I did one tour in Hawaii where I was able to go, I wasn't seagoing then. We called direct support, where my shop would outfit ships that didn't have the equipment, and they would go deploy, and then we would send off people to support it. When it would come back, we'd take it off, or not take it off, but shut it down. And I got to go to Australia, which was amazing. But that's really the only place in the Pacific farther west than Hawaii that I've been is Australia. I've never been to the Asian continent. I've never been off the coast in the Middle East, or anything like that. Never been to the Indian Ocean. All mine was Atlantic side, but I've been to Spain. I mean, if it's a Mediterranean port, short of I've never been to Israel, never been to Egypt. We actually went down across the line of death in Libya when Gaddafi was there with a battleship in tow, just to kind of say, nah. And this was, and I have some good video of some of the ships back then. It was life changing, because I don't see the United States the way somebody who's never left the United States sees it. I look at neighborhoods, and yet you go over to other countries, and it kind of goes from either rural to flats. It's urban to rural. There is no suburban, that you see much. Now, I've never been stationed in Germany, so I haven't been out in the countryside there. And most of the time when you pull into a port, it's in the worst part of town ever. So, you wind up, walking through it or driving through it really fast in a taxi. Fastest taxi drivers in the world, Germany. Craziest, Italy.
Good to know.
But, they get in the Mercedes and woof, they're gone. But I've been able to see that. And then I've lived in Maine. I've lived in Washington, D.C. I've lived in Norfolk, Virginia, Charleston. I did 3 tours on the Gulf Coast in Pensacola, Florida. Best beaches, bar none, in the U.S. or Gulf Coast.
So one of the things that my wife has a reaction to, having served in Afghanistan and spent a lot of time in the Middle East and some overseas stuff, is she gets really annoyed at the xenophobia of people that have never left America.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with saying America's great.
Right.
And you can even say it's the greatest nation on earth, but it doesn't mean everybody else sucks.
Right.
And everybody else is stupid.
Right.
In fact, she has a lot of reverence for a lot of the people, in particular from the Middle East, where she spent most of her time. And she gets very frustrated with people who have never left this country, who talk about the rest of the world like they have any idea what they're talking about.
Right. I mean, I met a lot of third country nationals over in Iraq, and Iraqis that were just normal people. All they want is to live like we do. I mean, one of the things that I tell people is how I approach people. I mean, whether it's, you, Rob, very successful radio commentator. I mean, everything you've done to anybody. We all get up and hope one thing in the morning, that our day doesn't suck. Yeah. I don't care if you're the president. I don't care if you're a general, a soldier, sailor, airman. Everybody just wakes up and goes, man, I hope my day doesn't suck. I got to wear my pants. The same way we all start off. So we all fundamentally that way. So whether you're from the Middle East or whatever, they're all victims of their own teaching. They're all victims of their own things. But a lot of them are just like us. They just want to live a peaceful, natural life. And, hopefully that, everything is left alone so that people can live a peaceful life.
So bringing everything full circle, how ultimately did you wind up owning NorCal Gun Vault? And you're what, 4 years in?
4 years in, yeah.
And how did that happen? Did you set out to own a gun store?
No, I mean, not initially. Because I worked as a contractor, and by that I mean I worked for Raytheon and some other electronics companies working on defense contracts. I'd kind of done it. I've been with DOD about 30 years, to include my military time, and that's kind of a long time. And I mean, from the time I went in, I mean, it wasn't like Full Metal Jacket where you're slapping people in the face and beating people up. But boot camp and the military goes from one side of the pendulum, and it really has swung to the other side of the pendulum. And it was time. I was going to go back on mid shifts, and I was like, man, I'm too old for mid shifts and late nights and stuff. So I looked at other areas, and I found a job in biomedical engineering. And so what I was doing was a field tech for ultrasounds and bone density, because the field that I'm an expert in is radio frequency, RF. Ultrasounds was basically it's not the same, but it's the same properties. And so I went into that. Well, I had a very large area. The equipment they kept adding onto our contracts was getting bigger and bigger. But we didn't have the people to have like a 2-man lift or 3 guys there to do something. We were doing a lot of it, and I started hurting myself. And, I'm in my 50s, so I wanted some mobility when I'm older. And I'd hurt my back. I was out. And so Tammy and I were talking about, hey, maybe, because Tammy is an entrepreneur. Tammy's had her own businesses before, had, good, bad, and different. She's had businesses before, and a couple of them have been very successful. So, she's like, maybe we ought to just look at going into business, you and me. And so we just started looking at what was available. We had gone into NorCal Gun Vault at a suggestion from Sportsman's because we were looking for AR parts. And they said, we don't carry them, but go over to these guys. They're real nice. And the gentleman, I had interaction with him, still works for me today. The store was great. We kind of had a good feeling from it. I liked the vibe of the store. We'd gone into a couple of others at different points, completely different vibe. And we're looking through business broker listings, and there's a gun store in Rockland Vale. We're like, let's look into this. And it turns out it was NorCal Gun Vault. And so we thought, this is something we could do. We're both outdoorsy. We like the outdoors. We like hunting, camping. We're both 2A advocates. But, we weren't like, we're not the hobbyists that bought a gun store and had to figure out how to run it. I have my degree in business. Tammy's got her master's. So we're business owners who own a gun store, and we're trying to, turn some things around with it to make it more successful than it was.
Well, and you joke in quotes that Tammy's like the brains behind the operation. Mm-hmm. You're there many days a week. Mm-hmm. And last I heard, Tammy's there Saturdays if she's there at all, because she's still doing her career.
Yep.
But you guys do run that place together.
Yes.
And we've talked before off the air with Christina and Tammy about the whole idea of being a team. Mm-hmm. And you have this great visual analogy of standing back to back with each other mm-hmm. and looking out at the world and that's literally having each other's back. Mm-hmm. And I love seeing that with you guys, which kind of brings us back to something you mentioned before about how ultimately everything that you've gone through, how blessed you are. Yeah. And you've mentioned family a million mm-hmm. times. And now, did you just have a wedding in your family?
No, there's one coming up in August.
Oh, it's coming up in August. 'Cause we were texting back and forth. You were in Florida. You sent me a picture of a drink you were having.
Oh, yeah.
And you mentioned a wedding, and I was like, oh, my God, that's right. What's going on? Because how many kids do you have?
Tammy and I have 4 children. We don't have any together. Her two sons. Actually, no, I'm sorry, not 4 children, 3 children. I'm adding grandchildren in there. I've got so I got my son Ren, and then Chris and Jason, Tammy's sons. My son Ren lives in Alabama now. He was kind of raised there, and then went back there and went back home. And then Christopher and Jason work with us, and so Christopher and Courtney, one of our employees there, have struck up a romance, and they're getting married. Congratulations! So.
Wow. Okay, so you've got your son working for you, and now his fiance works for you. Mm-hmm. Are they going to continue to work for you?
As long as they can, yeah. As long as we let them.
You got a lot of family and close friends working for you, and that's something you've seen around this operation at various times. And it's one of those things. It's got this high degree of difficulty unless you do it right. Because if you're doing it right, it can be such a cool thing.
Right.
So they literally met at NorCal Gun Vault, working together, mm-hmm. and now they're getting married. And they're the ones in August.
Yes.
Outstanding.
So yeah, it'll be fun. We're actually going to close down the store the day of the wedding because everybody in the store is invited to the wedding. So what are you going to do, right? Who are you going to leave to open the store, right? So,
right.
Yeah, but I mean, it's, we only close, certain days of the year, but that'll be a day that we close. We'll put on an email, post it on Facebook that we're closed that day, and we'll make sure everybody understands that, yeah, I know if you got to pick up your gun on that day, you may not be able to get in because the doors will be locked. So,
well, thank you for doing this. Eddie, you are such a great partner, and you've become a really good friend. And, we get the emails all the time. I think we've had, in the 3 years we've been working together, 1 or 2 quote-unquote complaints, and you have risen up, and we found out, in one case it was totally bogus, and in the other one it was a little miscommunication. Mm-hmm. Other than that, people just rave about you, which is exactly why we partnered together.
I appreciate that.
And you're a great human being. So thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah, appreciate that, Rob. Thank you very much. Like I said, it's always a pleasure. Love talking about it. There's so much more to talk about. You just can't do it in an hour.
Yeah, well, we'll have you back.
The RAD pROBcast. Did you enjoy this episode of the RAD pROBcast? Send an email to rad@radradio.com. A new episode of the pROBcast premieres anytime Rob feels like doing one.